What's going on, guys? Dan here, DD Speed Shop, and we're at a parts crossroads where I'm waiting on stuff. So I've been doing a lot of reading the comments, and I want to talk about gassers, specifically my gasser. Now, I call this 55 Nomad a gasser a lot, and man, in the comments, people lose their mind. That's no gasser, it don't got no beam axle in it. And you know what? You're right. It doesn't have a beam axle. It is independent front suspension. But that doesn't mean it's not a gasser. And we're going to have a bit of a history lesson. History lesson with Dan, which is scary because I was not a good student, which is going to make me even a worse explainer. Now, let's start at the beginning. So drag racing, you know, kind of started off in the 50s, early 50s, late 40s, whatever it was. And it was a rung what you brung, you know, dealio. And then as it progressed, they started coming up with classes. Now, one of the earlier classes, I think late 50s, 57, 8, was the gas class. Now, the gas class was essentially anything that ran on gasoline. So it was, for all intents and purposes, designed to be kind of what we have now, which is like the stock, pro stock, or wherever it may be. I'm not the best with drag racing classes, so bear with me. But essentially, your stock appearing vehicles racing. And they had, you know, A, B, C, D, whatever the heck it was in these gas classes, which changed pretty radically year after year after year. And that's kind of how the gasser started. So you have to look at a gasser kind of like a curve of where it started and where it ended. And where it ended is what everyone knows. You know, beam axle, nose high stance, power adder, stick shift, you know, big old tires, whatever it may be. Almost on the verge of a street freak with the gold flake and the lettering and all that, which is 100% correct. That is a gasser. But where it started, we're going back now, was these gas classes. And essentially the gas class, you know, was a stock kind of vehicle, and they would say A, B, C, and those letters basically worked out to be weight to cubic inch. So if you had, like, let's say a Model A with a big block Chevy in it versus a 55 Chevy with a big block Chevy in it, those wouldn't be heads up in the gas class. They would, well, I shouldn't say that, but in theory, the Model A would weigh less, and the big block in the 55 would weigh more. So they'd be in like an A class or a B class or whatever it may be. And they went all the way up to like H class or something like that, which was like 4 cylinders and flatheads and straight eights and all these things. So that's essentially how they did that back in the day. Well, hot rodders being hot rodders, every year would play within the rules. And you have to think back then, tire technology and all that stuff was just atrocious. So they had their grandiose ideas of how to win these things, win the class, win the races. And one of the ways they did it was raising the front end to have more bias to the back, the weight transfer, so it would go. Like, tires were just absolutely terrible back then. And then if you lower the rear end, all those things help. So you started getting this nose high look. Now, they put all sorts of rules in throughout the late 50s and the early 60s. You know, the crank center line was like 2 feet off the ground or something along those lines, so you could limit what you were doing. They were trying to get that weight transfer. And then on top of that, I mean, losing weight, so losing bumpers, fiberglass fenders, front clips, all that started coming in, and they started allowing more and more stuff into these gas classes. And that's how it went. Now, typically a beam axle with a set of leaf springs, wherever it may be, that would get you your lift. Typically they were lighter, depending on what you wanted to do. If you wanted like a spindle mount axle, you'd lose all the brakes. There's all sorts of stuff like that, all in the nature of going faster. Uncle Tony did a great video, I don't know when this is going to come up, but probably a couple weeks ago at this point, talking about the 60 foot and all these things and how, you know, how that all would work out down the road and taking weight off. And typically, I mean, it's in a, let's just call it like a 12 or 13 second car. We're talking in that window because that's the junk I deal with, or I wish it was that fast. But 100 pounds is a tenth, you know what I mean? So you can lose the front bumper and you're losing 30, 40 pounds. You could change the fenders over. You could drill holes and things. That is how that all progressed in the gasser category. And then they changed, or gas category, then they changed the rules along the way. So the early gassers were independent suspension and stuff like this, where they'd put on ball joint extenders, or they'd put spacers in, or they'd, put two sets of spindles together with bigger springs in it to do that stuff. They would pull the motor up and back. They put a limit to how far the motor could go back in it. So all these things were modifications in the rules. Let's be honest, when it comes to racing, you're cheating as much as you can without getting caught until they kind of put a rule around it. So where I do agree that a typical gasser, and a lot of these new classes they have now, especially for like guys that are into nostalgic racing and stuff like that, there are rules. And the rules are, it might have to have a beam axle or, or something along those lines. It may have to be a stick shift car. It may have to have all these, nostalgia type things. But those are more kind of exhibition things. And then obviously as tire technology and cars changed, the gas class kind of faded out, into the mid to late 60s, because cars were just coming around being faster without all this screwing around. So it kind of went away, and now it's just kind of cool, right? And it's come back, and I love it. I mean, I love the look of it. So that's my version of it. Technically, is it a gasser? Maybe, depending what year you want to read the rule book and all that. But I get where everyone's coming from. I just don't think everyone quite understood the way it all went down. So we're accomplishing a bit of a nose-high look with bigger springs and a few things like that. You take the bumper off. I'd love to find a set of fiberglass fenders or fiberglass hood scoop, stack injection. Daggone camera died. Anyways, like I was saying, there are some outlandish gassers, not even outlandish, but just nose-high, stick shift, the whole deal. And they're awesome. But that's not every single car out there. That's kind of like the end of the rainbow, and there was a progression to get there. And actually, even on drag week, I have the rules right here. The way they do it is kind of, a little bit different as far as I'm concerned. So they have their A and B gas categories is the way they do it. And there's probably a few subtle differences. I didn't read all the rules here, but the big thing I noticed was A and B gas class, man, I'm really starting to get tongue-tied here, is the year. So an A gas is 28 to 68, American, Trucker, Fordson, Anglia, all those sort of things, right? Those all got kind of added in. No convertibles or roadsters, which back in the day you could actually had a convertible gasser. B gas, 38 to 68. So that is kind of their way, I interpret it, as eliminating the, Model A, or whatever you want to call it, light hot rod to the more heavier stuff. Now, obviously in their rules, they have the same thing, steel body. You can have fiberglass front ends, flip front ends. You can have plexiglass windows, tailgate or lift gate or whatever you want to call it. Trunk lid can be fiberglass. Chassis, there's no tube chassis stuff, has to be square tube, I should say, not round tube. The engine can be set back, but no further than the base of the windshield. So there's a certain limitation there. Now this is where it gets interesting. Frame may not have round tube, we already went over that. May not have a lowered stance. A raised stance is encouraged. So stock height is probably allowed, you just can't be lowered, but they're encouraging it for the look that you all well know. And that's kind of the goal they're looking for. No center steering, a bunch of other stuff like that's kind of irrelevant. Now there are all sorts of other rules here. I'm just kind of going off of just the stuff that I'm looking at and what I want to talk about for my version of a gasser. Front suspension. There is two lines when it comes to front suspension. There's some interpretation there, but I'm going to let you know how I interpret it, and maybe you guys are totally different. May not use struts. Okay. Line 2, may not be Mustang 2 style, including similar aftermarket A-arm conversions. I read that as you can't have rack and pinion, because that's what Mustang 2 would be, and you can't do or similar conversions. Well, mine's stock. This has tubular control arms, which maybe, because it's tubular, there might be an issue, but Maybe you could just run stock, stamp steel stuff. And it's stock steering. So stock box, stock everything. In my mind, I think that would pass there in that section. I'm not saying the car would in general, but in that section, it has a raised stance, which is encouraged because I have big block springs in it. I don't have Mustang 2 front suspension. I think we're in the clear in my mind. I'm sure there's a bunch of other rules and all that we could fail ourselves out on drag week, but I actually think we would get in there without being too much of an issue. Now, further to that, obviously there's some cars that are nose high. Blasphemy is clearly a nose high, leaf spring front end. But there's other cars. The two-lane blacktop car is a perfect example of it. The two-lane blacktop car has kind of like a hairpin or like a reverse ladder bar set up on the front, and it has coilover shocks in the front, and it has a really level stance. I don't think anyone's going to argue that that is not a gasser in my mind. So I guess I wasn't trying to do the video to convince you guys that my car is a gasser, because ultimately it's my car and what I want to call it. If I want to call it a Flamingo, it's going to be a Flamingo. We're in 2023 here. It can identify as anything it wants. But from a actual rule book standpoint, it is a 58 gasser, or 59 NHRA gasser for sure. And as you want to look through it, I get it. I love the street freak look. I mean, I'm a poser, let's be honest here. I like the look of things as opposed to the actual function of it. This is a little unique because this thing should, hopefully, the amount of money it's in it, function very well and look cool. But in all reality, gassers now and all that, it's simply a street freak, nose high look, tunnel ramps, superchargers, hood scoops, plexiglass this, fiberglass, all these things, nostalgic lightweight wheels, all that stuff. It's a look, and it does work. But when you compare it to as technology came out and tire compound changed, I mean, back in the day, they were just trying to get going. Because again, that Uncle Tony video, that 60 foot was so important in your, extended ET.
So if you took 1/10 of, you shaved 1/10 of a second off your 60-foot time, you're going to shave 7/10 of a second off of your overall quarter-mile time.
Whereas now, what these guys are doing on like a 275 radial is astronomical. I'm sure if you had a time machine, you told these guys back in the 60s who were trying to lift the motor and push it back and do all these things just to try and get a time, what they can accomplish with a 10-inch wide tire is probably unbelievable. No one would even believe it. So technology always wins, as it turns out. But there it is. Hopefully you learned a little bit about gassers. And if I was dead wrong on a lot of stuff, man, put in the comments because I can learn things as it is. But that's it for now. Parts should be in here tomorrow. And we're back to working on my gasser. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment below. Subscribe to the channel. It makes a world of difference for me. It allows me to keep making these stupid videos and wasting money on expensive hot rod parts that nobody needs. See you on the next one.